Hello, welcome to Pay It Forward. So, who's up for a challenge? Now, I said I was going to keep it all varied, and I am, and this time we're stepping up. We're definitely stepping up, and I've been busy creating beautiful little pony unicorn for you all, and she is a little more challenging. So, but there are a couple of ways to make her. So I've given you a few options here. Now there's some hand sewing, there's some machine sewing, and with this one you don't want to be in a hurry. It's not a race. You have to remember it's all about having a really lovely sewing journey, and I hope you will. So a couple of ways to make her. You can make her up in fabrics, and you can make her up as a soft little cuddly lovey, and what child wouldn't love that? Or you can make her up in felts like I have, pack her very firm, and she will stand unaided on her own. I'm going to take you through it every step of the way. Now, you won't need magic to make this one, but you do need a really great pattern, and I have one of those for you, and it's in the description. All you need to do is click on that link in the description, download those free templates. Now you'll find there's a sizing guide in there I put in there for you, so you can make sure that your little printed templates are coming out absolutely spot on. And if you set your printer to print at actual size, you'll have them perfectly right, absolutely no worries at all. So now let's get started. So let's have a look at the pattern pieces that we're going to need to make up our little unicorn or pony today. So we have, I'm making mine out of felt. Now you can make this little unicorn up completely in fabric. The result will be slightly different in that felt has a lot more bounce to it, and it has a fuller sort of a look, more rounded look to it in the finish, but it will definitely work in fabric. Make sure you've got a nice, at least a medium weight woven interfacing on that fabric. You just won't have quite such a smooth finish as you get with felt, but of course some of the prints would be absolutely lovely made up like this, so you can go ahead and do that. I'm making mine in felt because I think we all know by now it's my favourite fabric. So mine is interfaced felt. You can see that I've got my side body pieces, and then I have my centre body gusset, which goes down the centre and underneath the pony, and I have my inside legs, front and back, and I have my little neck circle for the body. I also have my 4 little foot pads, and you can see these all just have interfacing on them. And then I have my head pieces. So my head pieces are my 2 side head pieces, and I have my centre nose gusset and then the back of the head gusset. And we have our little ears. So our little ears, we cut 4 of those, and I've actually cut a different colour for the inside of the ear, something that coordinates with your little project. You see there, I've got the little pink. And I also have my little saddle pieces. So for your little saddle, that's actually joined last. We pop that on last, so it's a separate little thing. I've actually got my little hearts already sewn onto my pieces there to save time. So you need your 2 little heart pieces. And in fact, you can use anything at all, any kind of little pretty thing that you want to stitch onto there. You may even have a little embellishment or a little really pretty button. You might want to do a little bit of embroidery. That's entirely up to you, but I've given you the little heart template. So you need your little saddle pieces. They've also got the interfacing applied, and that's 4 of those. Then we're going to need something for the hair, something for the mane and the tail. Now on this little one I've used a really beautiful yarn, but it's just an acrylic yarn, and it's twisted. It's 2 pieces twisted, which is really great because when you put it in as one piece, and then when your pony's all finished you can separate those strands and get that lovely crimpy look. So that one, this pony, actually I made this pony all just for this yarn because I liked it so much, so I built all the colours around that yarn. Now in this case I'm going to use braided cord braided cord has the same sort of properties in that we can sew it in very easily because it's in one piece, but then once it's all sewn in and we're done, we can actually open those little ends and open that all out, and it becomes a lovely crimpy a little fibre. So braided cord this time, and I'm using a variety of little colours to match my project. So we'll need some for the mane and some for the tail, and I will be telling you how much as we move forward. I also add a little rickrack braid around the little muzzle and to keep the little saddle on. This time I'm going to go for the little hot pink to match my little project. And you'll also need a little bit of Lycra. I've used Lycra, but you can use any fabric for the horn. You can certainly get some quilting cottons that have some glitter and shimmer in them. That'll work as well. Because I used Lycra, I have added interfacing on the back, but you'll need to interface your little horn anyway. So that just makes that little one stable. Okay, so just one piece of those. And then you'll need some little eyes. So in this case, we're adding eyes when we finish the head in traditional teddy bear making way. So I'm using glass eyes. I'm going to use the blue again. And if you're going to use buttons, you certainly can use buttons instead, but you'll need to use a button that has a shank. So not a sew through button with the holes. You want a little button that's got a little shank on the bottom so that we can set those into the head nicely. These are 12mm, these little glass eyes that I'm using. Now I'm jointing the neck on this little one, and you could check out my jointing video to how to make up my very simple joints. I'll put that link up here for you. This one I have a 50mm joint, and that is for the neck. Now, in saying that, if you wanted to sew this little pony's head on instead, you can do that. I thoroughly recommend that you joint it because you just get a much better result and it's much easier to do. But I will show the option to you for sewing that little head on. The beauty of having a little jointed head, of course, is we got all of this lovely posability, and she's just so sweet with her little head turned to the side. So that is a 50mm joint. And then for the horn, again, you've got two options. I'm going to joint it, and I have a little 16mm joint made up in the same way that I show you on my video. Tiny little discs there. But you can sew that little horn on too, and I'll be showing you how to do that if you prefer. For those joints, of course, we're going to need a spanner to do those nuts up. We're going to need some super glue or something very similar, just to drop into those onto those nuts at the end. We're going to need some clear craft glue, and we're going to need extra strong thread, both matching our base fabric and just for tacking and stitching. A little bit, I've got a little bit of, because I'm using a silver Lycra for the horn, I've also got a little bit of silver thread. It's just to wind around that little horn. You'll need some embroidery threads. Going to need to be sewing a little mouth in, and of course for your little saddle work and so on. Ideally, if you have forceps, it makes filling this little pony a whole lot easier, because we really have to get down into those little legs, and if you want your little pony to be standing, you're really going to have to pack this little one firm. You can see how firm she's packed, and that's what makes her stand up. You can alternatively just make her up, soft fill her, and she's a little cuddly lovey, and that's totally fine. You can do that. But if you want your pony to stand up, you're going to have to pack her nice and firm, like I'm going to show you. And you're also going to need, I think that's about it, well, a doll needle to put those eyes in, and a couple of pieces in there. A curved needle will be very, very helpful when we're sewing different parts on this little pony. Definitely for closing that back opening, a curved needle is going to be very useful. And also my wool felting needle for packing those fibres in when we're stuffing. And remember also that we will need polyester filling. This little pony is only filled with polyester filling. So that's it. So that's all that you'll need. So to start off with, let's start at the very beginning. Now I really am going to take you through this step by step, and we're going to do it piece by piece. And there's a bit, like I said, it's a bit of a step up and it's a little bit of a challenge, but really quite simple to follow if we do it in little baby steps. So our first step is to take our pattern pieces, our side body pieces. Now we have an opening here. Now here's the next thing, very, very important, that throughout this pattern that you've put in every little mark that I've given you on your pattern templates. They're very important, especially when we're constructing a body like this. But the first thing we're going to do is take the side body pieces to our machine, and we're going to sew a tight close little zigzag from this centre back mark to this centre back mark, which is our opening. That's how we're going to fill and stuff and join our little head on. So we just do that on both of those pieces, and that stops them from stretching, it stops them from fraying, and we want those edges to stay true. So you can go ahead and do that as our very first step. So our next step is to take our centre body gusset, and we're going to start adding our little inside legs. So we're going to take our first little inside leg, and this is the front leg. The back legs have the wider thigh and the little hock. So these are our little front legs. Now this is the front of our little pony. If you can imagine, this is the little front of our pony, and our little legs sit this like that. So we take our little front piece, and these are the more challenging parts of this little pattern. We need right sides together, and we need to remember that the little pony's feet have to be facing forward. And we're going to be sewing this curve here into this curve here. So the way that we do that is we're working from the gusset side, because it won't work from the other side. We work from the gusset side. And so we're going to line up this top edge here. That little point will slightly extend, just so that we capture our seam allowance. And pinning is everything again. And how we do this, so we're going to pin through both, and we're going to take up a little on the other side and pin that into place because it's a curve, and we're sort of pinning in 3D. I'm going to pin that curve right the way till it meets up the other side. So you can see there that I had pinned that one in, that little leg curve in, and then I've gone ahead and taken my needle, and with my extra strong thread I've just sewn an overcasting stitch to hold it into place. Then I've been able to remove my pins. So now we have to actually sew that seam to our normal 3 to 4 millimeter seam allowance, and because it's such a tight little curve, this one we need to sew in by hand. So on this one we're using a stab back stitch. Now it's the stitch that we're going to use right throughout this little project in different parts, and I really don't advise you to try and get this under the machine because it won't work. And these little circles are very important to the whole structure of the little pony. So that stab back stitch, if you haven't done one before, I'm going to put the link up to another video of mine that shows you exactly how to do that one. It's just a very linked back stitch. It's a very strong stitch, and you use your extra strong thread in a matching colour to your project. If you don't have exact matching colour, always go slightly darker rather than lighter. It will be less visible. So I'm now going to sew in. You can see I've just done a few stitches there, and I'm going to continue up to the other side, and then I'm going to repeat that whole process with my other little leg and do exactly the same thing, pin it in, overcast, and then stitch that stab back stitch. There you can see my little front legs are all stitched in nicely. So that's our little front, and now exactly what we just did with the two little front legs, we're going to do with the two rear legs. So you can see that I've pinned in one of those, and remember, toes facing forward. We want our pony going forwards, not backwards. So exactly the same thing. I will go ahead now and I will overcast those little two legs in. And now the beauty of this one is that we can fit this one under the machine. So we overcast this one in and then sew that little seam on the machine. And I sew all of my machine seams throughout this project. I sew them twice. So there I have all of my little inside leg pieces all stitched in nicely in place. And you can see that I'm keeping to my 4mm seam allowance, which is very important that we do that right throughout this pattern so that all of our little pieces, all our little body fits together beautifully. And so our next step is first of all roll out those seams between your fingers and thumb. That's what we do right the way through while we can still get to that. And then we're going to take our side body piece. So now we're going to start constructing this little body. So we take the front here, we've got a little mark here on our pattern piece, and we've got right sides together. We're going to match up the top, and we're going to match up that little mark with our little junction there. And you can see if you've kept to your seam allowance well, that will fit in just nicely. Now this one we can pin normally, and notice that we're working on this panel. Important that we work on this panel, because the way that we sew this little one really determines how well she stands up and all her limbs being nice and straight. So I really pull that one over, push that seam out, and absolutely lining it up with that little junction there. I'm going to put my pin right through that one there. And then I'm going to match up that little front leg all the way down to the toe, making sure that all those seams are matched. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing, and we're going to overcast first. So I will now go ahead and overcast that seam, and then I'll take it to the machine and I'll sew that seam 2 times. As I do so, that little seam, you can push it down. As you're stitching, push that little seam down. Okay, so stitch 2 times on the machine after overcasting. Now, and if you think, oh, skip the overcasting stage, it's not about being quick or slow, it's about being accurate. And all these years later, this is how I sew every single one of everything that I make. I always overcast first, and it's just for accuracy. And she's not a quick project, but she's a very exact little project, and she's definitely worth the time and effort put in. So there you can see I've sewn my 2 front sides on. What I did with the first side, I've just repeated with the second side, and that gives us our little pony front. So that will be his little front legs there, and you can see that I've also rolled out those seams while I can still get to them, and particularly on those junctions. And because we've met up all those seams nicely, everything's sitting nice and straight. So now we turn that one back through, and our next step is to sew those little legs. And remember, we're working on the side panels. We never work on the underneath here until we get right up to the back. So we stay working on the side panels. This keeps our pony standing nice and straight. So our next step is to sew the backs of our little front legs together, right up to that little gusset there. So we pin that one into place. And we make sure the end of the leg again meets that little junction, and we want to push that little seam inwards. So push that little seam down. And we're going to pin right on that junction. And again, I will be overcasting this little section. So we've got our little front leg. I'll be overcasting and stitching 2 times on the machine up to there. Then I just repeat exactly the same on the opposite side, and still always working on either side panel. So now my little back legs are sewn. So now the next section that we pin and overcast is from the back of that leg, under the tummy, around the back thigh, and join up that little front foot. We go ahead and we overcast, and then we sew that one 2 times. I'll let you know too, I use my stitch length on my machine is set at number 2. So we do that side and then flip it over to the other side and do exactly the same thing again. Pin him all up, match up that little toe on that side, overcast and stitch. So there you can see I've got my little rear legs, front rear legs now stitched in. You can see basically that makes up a little pony shape. So it is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. I hope you're still all with me. It does all come together in the end. You see it is just, you've just got to take it slowly and go piece by piece, and you can see that all that will work together well. That will pull up at the back and create the back of our pony. But before we move forward with that, while we still have our top open here, we're going to add our tail braids. We haven't added them earlier because it's hard to work around them, so better off to add them as late as possible. So adding our tail braids, you've got your little sections, your little marks on your pattern that show you where your tail braids are going to go in. Now I've cut 10 lengths of braided cord. Yours might be like mine was, just the little strands of wool, but I still cut around about 10 to 12 of those, depends on how thick your wool is. It's really just a matter of as many as you can pack into that little section there. So what we're going to do is we're going to add them. You can make your little marks on this side, it'll be hidden in the seam allowance so you can see where you're adding them. We start adding them. We need to leave a little space for our seam allowance to finish up our little sewing on our little bottom there. And we just want to extend them just a little, makes it easier for you under the machine. And we're going to line them up and we're going to pack them in. Now I find that I just start with one and then I just keep tucking them under the machine, press a foot as I go, and I just stitch them into place. So I'm stitching quite close to the edge here on my machine just to keep them in place. Now remember, we're stitching them on the right side so that when we sew our seam, they're incorporated into the seam here as that little tail is, as you can see there. So it's just a matter of lining them all up, and choose your colours as you go. I've decided to leave the hot pink out because I'm not very happy with that braided cord. And I'm going to add a couple of streaks of blue because of the blue eyes, and I'll just line those up and I'll pack as many in there as I can into that little section. So there are my braids. You can see how they're stitched just inside that seam allowance there, and I've extended those. So I've just packed in, there's 10 there, and the length of those, they're cut to about 20 centimetres. That's given us plenty of room for leaving an overlap here and for trimming up later. So the next step that I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim off, not right down to the seam, but just to make it a little easier for us to sew our back seam. And so now our next step is to tuck those little braids inside, and we're going to sew our centre back seam just from our marks just from the very base to here 2 times, and just from the neck edge to this little mark 2 times, and we leave this section open for filling. Now my little tail braids are nicely stitched in. My little back seam is just stitched, and I've pulled my tail braids out through that little opening to keep them out the way now while we finish off this little body. And so our next step is that we're going to pull up that back section, and we're going to sew the back of our hind legs. And again, you can see you've got a little mark there on your pattern piece. Your little mark there matches with your little junction there and lines up with your little back hock. Pin that one into place, right down to the back of the heel, and we will overcast and stitch that one 2 times, then flip it over and do the same on the other side. Right, I have my back legs now sewn, and so our last section is her little bottom section, and this whole time we've been working on the side panels. We've been doing all of our sewing from the side panels. Now we're going to flip and we're going to work on the gusset panel, and we're just going to fit that in. Now you've got a mark at the top of your little bottom gusset, put a pin straight through there and then straight through that center seam, and that will hold that one in place, and you can see that that little piece will just fit in beautifully. And we'll just add a couple of pins. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing as we have been doing right the way around. And now this section I sew by hand, just because it's way more accurate to sew it by hand, and it really is too tricky. You won't get that section under the machine. So I will overcast first and then sew that seam right the way around. Make sure you anchor in that top point with our stab back stitch, the same one that we used when we sewed in our little front legs. There you can see that little bottom section all stitched in there. So there we have basically our little pony body, just waiting for his feet and his little neck circle. Now I have to say, if you've got to this point, what you've just done is the most challenging part of making this whole little project. So if you've got to this point and you're still with me, you're doing awesome. You're doing really well. If you haven't thrown it across the room yet, then you're doing really well, and I'm right behind you. So keep going, keep going. It's going to be worth it in the end. So our next step, we're going to pin in our little neck circle. It's got a little joint spot in the middle. If you're going to be sewing your little pony's head on, you don't have to worry about that joint spot. I thoroughly recommend that you joint this little pony's head. It gives you a much better finish, and it's actually easier than sewing it on. But let's just move ahead. So we've got our little circle, and we're just going to pin it into our top neck section. The way that we do that is we put a pin through both layers, flip it over, take a little on the other side, and push our pin head all the way down. We're going to make our way around that little circle, and if you've got all of your seam allowances nice and even, you shouldn't have any problems with that little neck circle fitting. There you can see that little neck circle's all pinned in. Now all I need to do is go ahead and I'm going to sew an overcasting stitch so that I can remove all those pins, and then I'm going to sew that neck circle in using the same stab back stitch that we just used on that little bottom section there. Okay, so that's my little neck circle all sewn in. So our final steps with this little pony is to do exactly what you just did there. We do on all 4 of our little feet, pinned in exactly the same way, overcast, and then stitch with the stab back stitch. And yes, I know there's 4 little feet. Maybe have a cuppa in between each foot or something. Or snacks. I should have put that in the materials and requirements, shouldn't I? Must have snacks for energy. We'll get there. Okay, so once all those 4 little feet are sewn in, that is our little body all completed. So that will cheer you on. So let's get them done. All my little feet are done, all sewn into place there. So that's basically our body done. So all we need to do is turn this little one through. The easiest way to do that is with the little legs first. So you want to just tuck those little legs up, push them right up into the body cavity, and then you'll find it's easier to pull the body through using the little legs. And there we have a little pony all turned through. It's so nice to see some reward for all of our efforts. You see our little pony shape happening there. And I have also made, if you're jointing your little head, I've made the little hole through that joint spot with using my awl and my knitting needle just to part those fibres, ready for a bit later. So our next step is that we're going to, because we're jointing the head, we're going to take this opportunity to partially fill his little legs. Now, as I said at the beginning, filling this little pony, to have this little pony stand up, it requires that you fill him very, very firm. Now, I'm using my forceps, which are very useful for this. You can see that what I've done is I'm supporting that little leg there with my hand, and I'm keeping that little leg in the position that I want it to be standing. So I'm being very careful to hold that little leg in the right spot while I fill that out. And you'll be surprised how much stuffing can go into a little animal like this when you're firm packing it. So you want to be really packing out that little foot pad, that little toe section, but you really need to support that little leg as you do it. When I say that, what I mean is we don't want to be just holding it like this and just filling it up anyway, because what you'll end up with, it doesn't matter how good the pattern is and how well you've sewn it, you're going to end up with little splayed legs and your little pony won't sit right. So you need to be encouraging and thinking of how that little pony is going to be sitting the whole time that you're filling it up. And so I'm going to fill each little leg up nice and firm, holding each one into position as I do so. And once I get up to about just at this joint level here, what I'll do is I'll just throw a pin through and it'll stop my filling jumping back up. It just helps if we can fill out most of these little legs now before we go to add the head and everything else. It's better for the pony standing position as well. If you're just going to be, if you're making this as just as a bit of a cuddly toy and you just want to fill this pony just softly, you can, but you just have to remember that once that head goes on, that extra weight, your pony probably won't stand up. So you can see, I mean, with nothing in it, it stands up beautifully now, but once you add that little head weight, that's where you're going to have that she might be a little bit top heavy. So, but if you want to just make her as a little cuddly toy, certainly just softly fill her. We still need to add the head moving forward, so we're just going to fill those little limbs just up to those joints. So I have my little pony's legs all filled out just up to those joints there. See, I've put some pins in there that'll keep that stuffing down, and there's still enough room in there for me to be able to joint my little head. Now, if you were intending to sew the head on, of course you would fill that little pony body up and the head would be sewn on. The body would still need to be packed quite firm to make it easier for you to sew that head on. And I would recommend that you watch my section a bit further along that shows you how to fill this body, because there's a certain way that we fill it that makes it, you know, all stand up straight and nice, and certainly makes it easier for you. So for now we're going to be, because we're jointing that head, we're going to put that one aside and we're going to move ahead. We're going to make our little saddle now so that we have that all ready. You can see that I have my little heart shapes, so I've already fused them into place on one pair, and I have sewn around them with a blanket applique stitch. And if you haven't sewn a blanket applique stitch before, I've got a video that shows you how to do that. I'm going to put that link up there for you. So they're already done, and we have our other pair here. So after we've done that, our next step is to sew on each of these pairs. We're going to sew the centre back seam. With right sides together, we're just going to sew just our same 4mm seam allowance. I'm going to sew that centre back seam. Make sure you're back and forth on the edges, and we do the same with this one as well. I've got my little centre seam sewn on my saddle, and you can see that I've pressed those seams out nice and flat on both of those. Now we are going to be sewing these together, but we're not going to be turning them through. So our next step is to add our little rick-rack, which will hold our little saddle on under our little pony's tummy there. And so we're just going to add a little bit of glue, and those little strips are cut to about 12 centimetres. That gives us plenty of overlap room. We can trim those off, or about 5 inches. So 2 little strips like that. And I'm going to be sitting these little straps directly below my little heart shape, and I'm just going to glue them very lightly into place. Press those into place. It's really just to hold it for us, because as we stitch around that, we're going to be incorporating that into the seam, so it will hold quite well. So our next step is we're going to just gently glue these two together. So we just want a little bit. We're going to be sewing around the entire outside, but we really just want mainly that centre seam to be glued just into place. So just a little bit right the way around and a little over the centre section. So we're just going to connect those two edges, those two pieces together. And it's just a matter of laying that one over the top, lining it all up. So I've really pressed down that centre seam, and you can see that's all lined up nicely. If you've got any excess, don't worry, we can just trim that off. And so those little rick-rack ribbons are held in place now. So give that a good press down, and then while it's drying, I like to sit it in that little shape so that that glue dries and is encouraging that little saddle shape to happen. You can do that by just adding a pin at the bottom here, or one of your little clips, and we leave that just to dry. So we're going to let that dry for probably around about 10 minutes. Now once my little saddle is dry, you can see I've gone ahead and taken that one to the machine, and I've sewn a top stitch all around the outside edge, and that's kept those little rick-rack braids in there in place. And that is just a 4mm seam that I've sewn in there. And now I can go ahead and I'm going to sew a blanket stitch, as I have with this one, right the way around the outside. And I'm using my pearl thread, which is a variegated, just a little variegated one. Works with my little colours. And blanket stitch, doing it this way is really simple, because now we've put that top stitch line in, we've got a lovely little guide to follow, and it means that sewing that little blanket stitch is really quite quick. So if you haven't sewn a blanket stitch before, I have a video that shows you how to do that, and I'm going to put that link just up there for you. But blanket stitch is simply just your needle going in through both layers and coming out through the loop each time, and that will create that lovely little binding stitch. Blanket stitch is probably my favourite stitch. I use it on everything. Pull it through the loop each time. You can see that little binding happening. So I'm just going to make my way around that whole outer edge of that little saddle. And there I have my little finished saddle, all blanket stitched nicely, and I've just put a little clip at the bottom there. I'm just going to have that just hold that nicely in place while we get ready with the rest of our little pony. So now, before we move on to our head, I'm going to show you how to make the little horn. Now, you may be making this little project up. You can make this up just as a little pony, in which case you won't need the horn, so you can move ahead. But for making the little horn, you've got your little piece, and we're going to fold it right sides together, matching up those edges, and we're just going to sew. I'm going to sew an overcasting stitch first because it's nearly impossible to keep it all together under the machine when it's this tiny without it. So what I will do is sew that little overcasting stitch all the way along to that tip there, and then I will sew that same little 3 or 4 millimeter seam allowance right down there to the tip. Make sure you reinforce at the tip and reinforce at the base. You can see there that I've just stitched that little seam into place on our little horn, and then we're just going to turn that one through. Forceps are great for this. And we really want to push that little point out. So whether you use a little knitting needle to get right up in there, I'm going to get up there with my little forceps. Want to press it out, but we don't want to put a hole in the end. And this one's shedding silver all over me. Silver fingers. Okay, so get the line out, pushed out as much as you can, roll those little seams out. And then next step, and this applies to whether you're going to be sewing that little horn on or whether we're jointing it, and that is we're going to sew a little running stitch around the base. Easiest way is to pop that on your finger. I've got a doubled thread of extra strong thread. I'm going to start at the back, and it's just a little way in, maybe only 2 or 3 millimeters in. And it's just a little close running stitch all the way around the base of that little horn. Leave your tails hanging so that you can tie off. I finished my little running stitch, and I've just tied a little knot, a loose knot there, so it's ready to be pulled in. And now we're going to add our filling. Again, forceps are great for this. It's a very small area to fill, and it can be a little bit of a challenge. We want to keep those threads out the way. So it's really just about getting right down into that tip as far as we can. The Lycra is good for this because it's got a little bit of give in it, even though it has that interfacing on the back. So I'm just going to add little pieces, supporting it as I go, and also stopping it with my thumbs, stopping it from slipping back out again. So here's where you can use your little wool felting needle as you go. Just mind your fingers, but pack those fibres in right into the tip, and it'll stop it jumping back out at you, so that you can add more, because as hard as it seems, we need to pack this little horn quite firm. So that's just going to keep those fibres in there a little better, and I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to keep packing and holding and packing until I get right up to the top here. And you can see there that I've got my filling all packed down. Now this really makes all the difference. Using your wool felting needle means that I can pack that in there and it's not jumping back out at me, and also my little horn is nice and firm. So now what we're going to do is, before we pull that in, we're going to want to make some little swirls on our little horn to pull it all in. The way that we do that is with a thread, and we're going to add our thread. Now I'm just using the extra strong thread just for demonstration on this one, and I'm just going to put my needle in, my medium-sized doll needle, straight up the center, and I'm going to come straight out at the top and pull that one in. There's a nice knot in the end, and that's going to help pull that filling down too. And we can just leave that one on. And so our next step depends on whether we're jointing or whether we're going to be just sewing this little one on. Now, getting that little base nice and flat is really important for sewing it on, just as it is for getting our little disc in. Now, if we were going to be adding, jointing this one, we would now slip that little one in there, our little joint, and we would tie up around that little bolt, just as I have there. See, that one's all tied up. But if we're going to be sewing this one, this little horn on, we just take our threads and we're going to gather that in just enough to tuck those edges in. We want to be able to tip those little edges under. So it's just about encouraging them under. It's not about pulling it right in completely closed. It's just about encouraging them in so that when we go to stitch it on, we can make that area nice and flat. So pull it into about that size and then knot off around about 3 times. So once you have your little horn, whether it be to sew in or to joint in, and that one's all tied up, we've got our needle on, still on, and in this case I've got my metallic thread, and it's really just a simple matter of travelling down just a little bit, diving into our little horn, pulling that thread through, and we're just going to wind around that little horn shape as many times as you like. Keep the tension up. Pull that in nice and firm. When we get to the bottom, we're just going to dive in. Going to come out somewhere at the back there. Keeping that tension up nicely. Straighten up your little horn. Then I will dive back in, come out at the base, still keeping that tension going, and I will cast off underneath here where those stitches won't be seen. Just a couple of stitches and a little knot, and that will be held in place. And there we have our little horn all ready to be jointed into place on that little pony's head. Or if you're going to be sewing yours on, that one's all ready to have those edges tucked under. It'll be settled on his head and you will slip stitch that into place. Now the little horn will get sewn on right at the end if you're going to be sewing it on. And also so will that little twisting tie. That will be done after you've sewn it to your pony's head, because you've got more to hang on to and you won't crush that base. Okay, so moving forward, our next step is to start with our little ears. So we've got our little ear pieces, we're going to get those ready too. So we have our little pairs, and I'm having purple on the inside of my little ears this time. And so it's just a matter of right sides together, and we're going to do the same thing and we're going to overcast each little ear, and we're going to be sewing from just a little way in here at the base, because we want to leave the major part of that ear base open, and we'll just be sewing to the corner, up around the top, down and just in a little way. And you only need to sew the little ears just one time on the machine, but I do reinforce that little tip and those little corners. So you can overcast first if you like and do both of those ears in the same way. Once you have your little ears sewn up, I'm just showing you that little seam there. I really keep that seam as small as I can on that ear, so we've got less bulk when we're turning it through. And then I have turned that one through, and you'll find that your forceps, your little forceps, are really useful for this, and pushing those corners all the way out. And now another thing that I do, it's optional, but I find that the little ears sit very nice. I've got a little bit of clear craft glue here, and I've got a little wooden skewer. I'm just going to get a little bit on my skewer, and I'm going to slip it in between those layers, and I'm just going to apply some to the ear inside, right up to the top, and avoid that little bottom edge. And then we're going to press those two layers together, but leave that little base open because we want to just slightly turn those little edges under. Now the reason that I do this is it gives it a lovely little cupped shape, and you find that we can let that glue dry and it really encourages that little shape there, like we've got a very little cupped shape on those little ears there. And also that little extra layer of glue makes those ears lovely and firm, and they sit up nice and perky. So we're just going to press that one, get your thumb right in there, mould that little ear around, and then we let them dry in that little shape, and I will do the same with the other ear. Okay, so now we're ready to get started on the exciting part, which is our little pony's head. I guess it's all exciting, but the head is really fun to make. Okay, so our first step is we've got this is our back gusset. So this is the little piece that sits in behind the head here, and this is where our mane goes. So we're going to have to add our little braids now. You've got your marks on your pattern that tell you from where to where. It actually, we just have to start just a little more than the seam allowance from the end. Now this little curved end here, this is the start. So this is here. So if you're using different coloured braids like I am here, you'll want to be mindful of how you're placing them as to how they'll sit. My little pony's going to have little blue eyes again, so I'm going to bring some blue streaks in at the front, but I'm going to start with my purple, and just as we did with the tail, we're just going to overlap those edges. So you want to lay your braid out, and take that one to your machine, and as we did last time, we're just going to stitch those braids on within the seam allowance, so as close as you can to the edge. We're going to stitch them on, and as I go along I just keep adding a piece of braid and adding a piece of braid, and you want to fill that section up until your next mark here, not beyond it. You can finish a little way above it, that's fine, but not beyond it, because this is where our little neck joint is happening. So just as we did the little tail pieces, we're going to stitch all those into place, and I'll be adding as I go and choosing my colour selection as I go. Okay, so there you can see all of my braids are stitched into place on that piece. I can flip that over, you see that's just a very narrow little seam. I'm going to do what I did with the tail, and I'm just going to trim those back, not right to the edge, but just enough so that it's got some hold and so that I can see to pin my other piece together. So now we're just going to finish that piece by putting right sides together. This is our neck and this is our front here, and so we will pin and I will definitely overcast to make sure. I want to make sure that my edges are all matched up along there, which is why I will definitely overcast that. Make sure that end, want that all to meet up, and I will overcast along there through those little braids, and then I will stitch that center seam 4mm 2 times. You can see there that once that seam is sewn, all my little braids are nicely incorporated and very secure within that seam there. So the next step is to, just at the front here at the beginning where that little pony's hair starts, just up here, I've just opened my little seam up there and pressed that flat. And now to complete that full head gusset piece, we're going to add the little nose piece, and that's going to sit straight across the front there. And you've got a mark in the center, so you know exactly where to put your pin. You want that pin to go straight through that center mark and straight through that center seam that we have there. And then we're just going to overcast across the seam there, and then we're going to sew that seam twice. And you can see what that has given us now is that full center panel piece to be sewn in the head. So I've pressed that little seam forward. Just finger press, manipulate that little seam forward, and we can put that one aside ready. And we will start on our 2 little side head pieces, and we put right sides together, and the first seam that we sew is our center chin seam. And we make sure that that little point is perfectly lined up, as is the rest of our chin, and that little point there at the neck. So the seam is the same 4mm seam, and I will overcast it first as usual, and I will sew that little seam there 2 times. My little pony's chin seam is sewn now. You can see I've taken a couple of those little overcasting stitches out so I can press that little seam out flat, and then I've gone ahead and rolled out that seam. So we've got a lovely rounded front muzzle. Pop that one back through, and then we take our completed headpiece and we're going to pin that one into place. Now we've got a mark at the center of the nose there. Now it's very important to make sure that all of our sewing and our pinning is very accurate. It's a very important part of the little pony's head. And we put our pin straight through that little mark, and then we're going to go straight through that seam at the front in the seam allowance, and we want to come out right through that seam in the center and really anchor that little nose in. And holding that one, we're going to put a pin either side, just pinning as we have before in 3-dimensional way. So that we get no puckering and so on. Now you'll also see that you've got another mark a little bit further up. On your pony's side headpiece there. And we're going to be sewing until that mark. We just do this section for now. So you can see that I'm just going to pin that one all into place. Right up to this mark, make sure that they're level, and then we're going to go ahead and sew an overcasting stitch around just that section, and then we're going to sew with a stab back stitch to really set that little muzzle in nicely. Make sure that you're careful to really center and anchor that little front section in. Once you've got that little nose section stitched in there, we'll just pop that one through and just check that everything's as it should be there. Roll those little seams out again. You can see we've got a nice little even front there, that little nose section. Pop that one back through, and now we just finish the seam by taking our one side, and remember that we're working on the head gusset, we don't sew from the side head panel, and we're just going to pin this one in the same way, rotating our work as we go, and we're going to pin it, and it will meet up at the base of the head there. Again, important to watch all of our seam allowances so that all does marry together well, and we will sew that seam, and this one can go on the machine. But I would overcast that one first, and then I will sew that seam 2 times. Make sure when you're sewing that one that you push that little seam forward as you go, so make sure it's sitting forward, so it just means the whole front of the head sits better. And then once you've done that side, you do exactly the same with the other side, and remembering that we're still working on that center head panel. So now I have my little pony's head all turned through, and I've gone ahead and rolled out all of those seams. Now my next step, because I'm jointing my little horn, is to add that little horn, and the little joint spot that you put in is just about 5 millimeters from that little seam line here, and so that little horn will just sit and just extend over that little seam line a little. If you're sewing your horn on, you won't be doing that until our head is all put together. So, but if you are jointing it, we're just going to pop that one in there. I've made a hole big enough with my awl and then my knitting needle. I want my seam of my horn to be at the back, and I'm going to press that one in, and I'm going to make sure from the inside that that fabric is really pressed all the way down around that little bolt, right into position, that everything is sitting nice and flat. And then I'm going to add my little resin disc. I don't need a washer because it's a resin disc. And then my little nut, which I can finger tighten. And then we can check our position. Check that I've got that lined up with that back seam. And then I just go ahead with my spanner and tighten that little nut. And once I have that little nut tightened, I can just go in with my super glue and just add a drop into my threads there, so that little nut will never come off. And I just leave that just open just for a couple of minutes to make sure that that super glue just dries. We don't want that going anywhere else, so I'll leave that for a couple of minutes. So now we can move ahead and we can start filling up our little pony's head. And we're going to do that. I'm going to be using again my forceps, and we want to pay particular attention to the front of our little pony's nose, and we really want to make sure that that gets filled out. Again, nice and firm, because we're going to be adding our little eyes, and we want a nice solid base to be doing that. So it's a matter of really pushing that stuffing up. Make sure you're filling out that nose section evenly, and support that little nose section as you're filling. And again, you'll be surprised just how much this little pony can take as far as filling goes. And if you have jointed that little horn, make sure that you get your filling nicely in around all around that little joint, and fill out the top of that little head. So I'm going to fill that one in and I'm going to fill right up to nearly the top edge here, and that applies to whether you're sewing it on or whether you are jointing this little one on. Okay, so you can see that little pony's head now is all nicely filled out. It's nice and firm, and you can see the level to which I filled that. Now that applies to both ways, sewing the head on or jointing it. I've also used my wool felting needle to pack all that in and to give me a nice flat surface, which really helps. And so now that's not going to move, and it's nice and solid. Now I've gone ahead and taken a double strand of my extra strong thread, and I have sewn a running stitch right round the outside neck, starting at the back and sewn right the way around, left my tail ends hanging, and I tied just one knot ready to pull that in. Now if you're going to be sewing the pony's head, you'll pull that in a little and tuck those little edges under right the way around, and then once your little pony's body is filled, which it isn't now because we're jointing the head, but once your little pony's body is filled and this is all filled out nice and firm, it's simply a matter, make sure you're tucking enough of that edge under, and you're just going to pin that little pony's head on all the way around, right the way around that neck edge. You'll find that it will fit beautifully. And then you can go ahead and just slip stitch that little head into place with your extra strong thread in a matching colour. Now, of course, if you're sewing the head on, you only get one head position. So you can choose to sew that little head on in a little jaunty little head tilt there like that, or you can match it up and make it just looking straight ahead. That's entirely up to you. But it's just a matter of pinning it right the way around, slip stitching that little head into place, and of course that happens only once your body is all nice and firmly packed. But for now, I'm going to be jointing the head, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my little disc, my made up little joint disc, which is a 50 millimeter disc. And we're going to slip that one in place, trying not to crush his little horn, and then I will just pull those threads in right around that little bolt and tie them off about 4 times. And that's the little pony's neck all pulled in and tied off several times. So that little head is now ready to joint to the body. And we already have a little hole made in that little neck section. So I'm just going to slip that little one through. And I've only got filling in the legs, so I can still get in there. Got to tuck that joint in. Exactly the same as we did for the little horn. We've got to make sure that there's no fabric around that little joint. That little disc is sitting nice and flat. And we can slip our washer on, a bit hard to see in there. And our little nut. Finger tighten that one, and just make sure that you really have got everything pulled out well. Make sure there's no filling in between those layers. You can check that you've got a nice clean little neck joint there. Then it's just a matter of getting in there with your spanner and tightening that little joint until your little pony head can just move, because it will compress over time and loosen up. So we tighten that one up and then just do exactly the same thing as we did with the horn and add those couple of drops of super glue into that thread. And then we'll let little pony just be a little bit tricky for a bit and stand on her head for a little bit. And just while we let that glue just dry for a couple of minutes, then we're going to come back and start filling her little body. So our next step is to start filling up our little pony's body, and I'm going to start with, so there's a bit of a method to this, especially if you're wanting your little pony to be freestanding. So we start first of all up around that neck joint, and we're going to fill out the front of the neck. So it's just getting our fingers up in there and around the front of that neck section there, and really filling that out. We're going to try and fill out that chest section right the way down to where our legs start. Because especially if we have a little neck joint, we want that that neck joint can move and it's nice and firm and secure around it. So packing in around that little joint, you can see we're going to fill up right down to there. We've got our pins still in our little legs, that's going to help us keep that filling there. And I actually I'm standing up and standing over this little pony so I can see everything and I can see where that stuffing's going. And so then our next section, so we do a little bit at a time, and we're watching the shape of our pony the whole time that we're doing it. So next I'm tucking into her little back end, and we want to fill out this little bottom area. So tucking in there and pushing all the way to the back. We want to fill out this little bottom thigh area, the back of the thigh here. And as those sections get nice and full, then we can take our pins out, just keeping our stuffing in place. Start with our front legs. And we can start adding filling. Move your hair, little pony. We can start filling down into that section there. So you can see I'm really pushing it. It's very important that this section of your little leg joins are really firmly packed. That's what will hold your pony up. But we do a little bit on the outside of the leg, and then we do a little bit, you can feel, on the inside of the leg. And you see how I'm holding that little leg in position while I'm doing it? So the whole time I'm thinking about how my pony is going to be standing, how I want those legs to be. I don't want to be filling her and holding her leg out here and packing the stuffing in, because that's exactly how her leg will stay if you do that. So the whole time be mindful of keeping her a nice little lady with her little legs nice and straight and together, very elegant, and going from side to side and side to side. And then we do the same thing at the back. So again, we're supporting this little leg and we're adding our filling down into that thigh section. Once you're ready, take your pins out and be going from side to side to side. So it's all happening nice and evenly. And once you've got these sections packed nice and tight, and up here is nice and firm, her little bottom is nice and firm, she needs a firm little bottom, and then we just fill in this tummy and midsection, nice and firm, leaving just enough room for us to close this opening. Right, so now once we've got our little pony body filled, and I do realise that filling a little pony like this to stand up, it can be a bit of a challenge, but you just go very slowly. Make sure that you're filling out every section, check your little pony underneath, and then you've got her all done nicely. Again, if you're just making this as a little cuddly toy, you can just fill her up softly and she'll just be huggable and a little bit of a wobbly pony, but I'm sure she'll give much love. So our next step, you can see that I've got her filled up now right up to the top there, and I've used my felting needle again just to tuck everything in nicely, but I've got enough give there to be able to pull that little seam in, and we're going to be closing this seam with a ladder stitch. If you haven't closed an opening before, it can be a little bit challenging, and this is on a curve, so it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. So we use a curved needle. Now I do have a video that shows you how to sew a ladder stitch to close an opening. I'm going to put that little link up there for you. You might want to have a look at that one first. But I've got my curved needle, I've got a single thread of extra strong thread, I've got a huge knot at the end, and I'm going to start, pop my needle in, I'm going to start right at the beginning where that seam begins, at my seam allowance of 4mm. So I'm going to come through, that little knot will hold behind the fabric there, and my next step is to travel across and to go in just a little way across and take a little stitch down. Our curved needle certainly makes it easier in this section. So tucking that one under, and you can see our first little stitch is sitting across like that. We're going to give that a little squeeze and a pull in. Get our threads out the way. I've got her hair up in a little updo at the moment so that we can see what we're doing. Then I'm going to go back into that same hole, and I'm going to travel down just a little way again, and this can take, look, it's just a little bit of manoeuvring. It is for me too. It's just because of the positioning on the pony's back. Okay, and we tuck that one in, and we just keep our stitches nice and even as we make our way down. Squeezing that one in, and you can see that's going to knit that little opening together, and it's going to close it beautifully. Now the little saddle is going to go directly over this opening, so if you're having a little bit of trouble, don't worry too much, because we're going to cover it up with that little saddle. So I'm just going to make my way down right to the end, pulling that one in as I go. As I said, check out that video and see if that gives you a hand. So there you can see my little back seam is done, and now we can add our little saddle. Aren't you glad we made it earlier? So we can just pop that one in place. You can see that that will just line up nicely. While we're just putting that on, you can actually throw a couple of pins in there so that we've got those seams lined up. So I'm just going to pop one in there, straight through, and straight through that top there. And all we need to do is pull those little rickrack pieces under. I like to pull them quite snug. Pop a pin in. There we go. And what I'll do is I will just snip off those two ends, just so that I've got just probably about 2 centimeters overlapping, and then I'll just throw a couple of stitches in there that will hold that one in place, and then you'll have your little saddle in place there, and then we can take those pins out. You can see there also I've undone my braids, giving that lovely crimpy look to that little tail. So now we have our little pony. You can see there that I've actually unravelled her little braids, so she's all pretty and crimped, and I've given her a little trim there. You can have those, the tail and mane, as long as you like. I like it to sit a little touching the ground there. Now our little blind pony needs some eyes, so what I've done there is I have gone ahead and chosen my eye placement. You can see where that sits, where their little eyes sit, are right tight in that little section there. Just where it starts to fan out again, I've used little eye tester pins that show me exactly where my little eyes need to be. You can do the same thing with just a normal little pin. That will give you a good idea also. Once you've chosen your eye placement and you're happy with that, then you make your little hole with your awl, and then I just enlarge it just a little bit with the end of my knitting needle, and I have ready my large doll needle. So my large doll needle to pop the eyes in, and my little eyes are going to be the little blue glass that I have here. Now you might be using buttons. If you're using buttons, make sure that they're a button with a shank, and you will put them in exactly the same way as I'm going to show you now. So first of all, we're going to get a long doubled length folded over of our extra strong thread, and then we're going to double it over again, so we've got 4. So it's actually 4 threads, and I've got the little top loop here, and I'm going to take that loop and I'm going to pass it through the little shank of my eye, open up that loop, and pull the main body of that thread through. So I've got my little eye on a really tight little knot there, you can see there, and then I go ahead, I'm going to snip those ends, I go ahead and thread all those ends through my doll needle. So that eye is going to be very securely in place. Now I just take my doll needle and I dive straight through that hole that I've made, and I come out somewhere at the back of the head. Now you can put the eyes in while your head is off the body. That's entirely up to you. Now we come out somewhere right in the center, so close to that seam. But sometimes it's easier to have the body to hold on to. It's entirely up to you. Sometimes that little head can be rolling all over the place when you're trying to put eyes in. You see I've temporarily pinned my ears into place. That helped me with my eye placement. So I've pulled that one all the way through, and I'm just going to tie a little knot in the end of this one, just so that I know which eye that one belongs to. So I've pulled that one out. Now I'm going to repeat the same process with the other eye, and I'm going to take that one through and I'm going to bring it out the same hole that that one came out of. And so now I've done that with the second eye, and you can see that I've got the 2 threads out the back of the head here, and I've tied a first little loose knot. So now I've got both my threads, got my knot tied, and I can press in those little eyes, and I can pull on those 2 threads at the back, pull that knot in tighter, keep checking and adjusting my eyes, pulling each side until my eyes are set evenly. Pull them right in and knot that off very tightly, and then knot it off 2 or 3 more times. And that little knot is being tied into the stuffing. It's not being tied into the surface of the fabric. That little knot will drop back into the head and be held by the filling. So you can pull them in quite tight. They will loosen up just a little. If you have trouble getting that second eye through that same hole, you can just enlarge that little hole so you can see it more with your awl. So I'm going to pull those in tight and tie those little eyes off. So our next step is to sew in our little pony's mouth. So we're going to start with our doubled thread. I've got some pearl thread here, and I have my medium-sized doll needle, and you can see at the side of my little pony's mouth there, I've made a little mark that side, and I've lined it up to be exactly that side. What we're going to be doing is just one big stitch that makes a little smile across the front and into here. So what we want to do is we want to come in at the back of the head, we'll come in behind, and we want to come out right on one of our little spots there. And there we go, and we're going to pull that one all the way through. Now we've got a little knot at the end. What we want to do is hide that little knot in the back of the head. So we're going to make that hole that we just went into just a little bit bigger so that we can pull on that knot, and you can see that just slipped away into the head, but it will still hold in our filling. So now we want to pull that little mouth thread around nice and firm, and we want to take our needle and go back in the other side, keeping the tension up nicely. Go straight into that hole, straight into that mark, and we're going to come out somewhere at the back of the head again where we'll be able to cast off and it won't be terribly noticeable. Pulling that one through, and we want to make sure that our little threads aren't twisted as we pull that one round. Pop that one into position. Pull our threads in. You want to really get some nice tension there to really pull that little mouth section in. Keep that tension up. I've got my thumb on that one there, and I'm going to dive back in. I'm going to come out on that little seam line there. Remembering to keep up my tension. This is where you need 6 hands. Check our little mouth is still in a good spot. And then we just make a couple of little stitches right on that seam line, tie a knot, and then sink it back into the head. And there we see the little mouth line in place. That little knot is hidden back in the little seam line there. Now our next step is to sew our little ears into place. Now we will be adding a little braid which will go around and under and up behind his ears, but I like to sew his ears on first, so then we know exactly where that braid is going to sit. So let's start with the ears. Now the ears, it's very important the ears sit in the right place on this little pony. They need to sit up quite straight and up on top of the head. You can see exactly where I put my first pin in. So my pin goes through that little seam of my ear. My little ears, I've just overcast that lower edge, just very tight little overcast to close that and turn those edges just under a little. They're going to be not seen because they're going to be sewn right into the head. So that little pin goes through. You can see it's probably about 4 millimeters from that seam where my pin goes in, and it's probably about 1.5 centimeters from this one here. But have a look at it. Check what looks good on your little pony, and our pin is going to go straight in. So the angle of the pin is important, so the pin goes straight in. And then our next pin, we pull that ear back. Our next pin goes in just about on that seam line. A little way back, which pulls that ear up, and then we just curl the rest around. That final little pin, we'll just hold that little ear. Now take a bit of time with this to make sure that you're getting them both right. You need to check them again. You want to be getting them exactly the same. Once you've got them all matched up, we can then go ahead and sew them on. Now most people just ladder stitch, slip stitch their ears on, and they slip stitch it just with a little needle to the top of the head. And I find that when you do that, ears tend to never sit right. They fold over and they don't sit the way we want them to. So this is my method for sewing on ears, and it's much easier. It's not as fiddly. It's a fiddly job anyway, sewing on ears. It's probably the task I dislike the most, is sewing ears on. But so I've come up with this way that makes it easier. So I'm working with my medium-sized doll needle. I've got my extra strong thread, I've got a knot in the end, and I've got quite a long thread because we're going to be doing some needle sculpting here. So we're going to come in at the back of the head. So this is where we start, and we're going to come out just in the head, just below where the first little stitch, where our pin is, where we want our first little stitch to be to hold our ear in place. And pull that one through, and just as we have before, we're going to just make that hole a little bit bigger for our little knot to sink into, so that's hidden. Pull that one through, and now we can take our needle and we're going to take some of that little ear and we're going to dive back into that head, and we're going to come out somewhere at the back of the head, and it doesn't really matter where, and we're using a thread that matches. So that pulls our first little section down. So now we're going to go back into that same hole, and we're going to come out again. We really need to anchor those ears down at that very beginning point. So you can see that's pulling that little ear down, but it's not just pulling it down on the surface, it's actually, if you can imagine, it's like a web that's pulling them in. So they're going to be very strong. And so we're going to take another little stitch, and we're going to come out again at the back of the head, just anywhere randomly. Pulling that one down. You can see those stitches are quite hidden because you're really being able to pull it down, which you can't do if you just ladder stitch them on the surface. So I'll go back into that little hole again, and you can see that I'm just going to make my way around the whole base of that little ear, and it's easy for me to see. I'm not trying to bend the needle in an awkward position because I'm just coming in and out and in and out, and I'm going to make my way around that whole base of that little ear, checking that my pins stay in position as I go, and as I go past my pins I take them out, and I'm going to work that all the way down, finish up with the ear here. I'm going to come out at the back of the head and just finish off with a little knot right on that seam line, rethread the end and go back into the head, and you've lost your knot like you did before. So that's how I'm going to sew on both of those little ears. And there we have her little ears all stitched nicely into place. Now if you were sewing your little unicorn's horn on, now is when you would do it, because now you've got your ears there, your eyes there, and you're ready for that placement. So it's just a matter of turning your little edges under of your little gathered edge and just pinning that. You would just pin it all the way around and then slip stitch that little one into place. Like I said, I find it easier to joint it. It's a much cleaner finish, but a simple slip stitch all the way around will work just fine, and then just winding your little thread around and securing it underneath that little horn. So our final step with this little one is to add our little face braid, and we're going to take a length of our rickrack or whichever braid. Any braid will work with this. So many pretty little braids you could use. And we're just going to go over her muzzle. It's about at the same depth as her little mouth. And we're going to go over and we're going to cross that over underneath her little chin. We really want to pull that quite snug. So while I've got that nice and tight underneath there, I'm going to throw a pin right on that little cross section there. I'm going to pop a pin straight in there, and so that will hold that in place for me. And then I'm just going to pull up each side, up behind her ear, and choose which side you want that little overlap to happen under that little mane. It doesn't matter which side. And pull that one up to meet. And what we're going to do is make a little part in the hair. Just a little clear, a little spot. She's got so much hair. Just slip that over and we'll pull that one up on the other side. And then it's just a matter of trimming those ends. Trimming those ends, and I will trim this one right up to here and this one here, and we just throw a couple of stitches in there. I also then like to go around with my curved needle and just very occasionally add a couple of very tiny holding stitches, not with an extra strong thread, but just with a normal machine thread, just so that they're quite invisible, but they just hold that little one into place. Realistically, it will hold itself into place if you only stitch it here, but if you feel a little better about adding a couple of little stitches, just go right ahead. So I'm going to pop that one on now. And there we have our beautiful little unicorn ponies all done. It was a big sew, wasn't it? I'm glad you came along for the ride, and I hope you've learnt some things. There's lots of new techniques there, and certainly you will have learnt that you can vary this pattern in so many ways, and you can make it, as I said, just a soft little cuddly, or something to for a child for comfort would be absolutely lovely, or you can make it more as a soft sculpture, which I have here. And you can see they're perfectly happy to stand up, and that certainly will do for many years. So I can't think of a better gift for a child. What a beautiful gift moving forward. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you've really enjoyed making her. Well, thank you all for joining me and staying with me today. That was really a mission, wasn't it? But we got there in the end, and what a beautiful little result. I hope you've really enjoyed making this little one. I know that she's been challenging. I hope you've tried out and had a think about all the different options to be able to make her. She's a lovely step up into soft sculpture. If you have enjoyed this video, you could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beaut. I'm really loving hearing from you all. I love receiving the pictures that you're sending me on Instagram. So follow me on Instagram and you can send me pictures of, and now you know what I'm going to say, I want to see unicorns now. I want to see unicorns and ponies. I would love to see this little one made up just as a standard lovely little country pony. Wouldn't it be wonderful with all of the browns and the lovely little saddle and the tan? Anyway, I'm going to leave that to all of you, but make sure, keep talking to me in the comments. Tell me if you've liked the step up. Tell me if you want some more challenging ones like this. Of course, I'm going to keep it varied, and there's plenty more patterns coming your way. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any of those. Most of all, everybody, all of the good things that come your way, just pay them forward. We all can. Till next time, it's Huru from me.